Having your class followed immediately by a class that does the whole unit in 1 week, one class meeting, I'm having a lot of trouble remembering where I stopped with you guys, and I couldn't even remember, getting to starting this part at all in class. So did I explain the 3 types of capillaries?
Yes.
Okay. Did I tell you where we find them?
Yep.
Where are the sinusoidal capillaries found?
In the brain? No, spleen and liver.
Spleen and liver, filtering organs. The kidney's a filtering organ, but it doesn't have sinusoidal capillaries. What type of capillary do we find fenestrated? Right. I didn't tell you about fenestration, did I? Okay. About cats?
No.
So I did tell you that fenestrated or fenestrations mean little windows. Okay. The only place I'm aware that word shows up outside of the context of anatomy like this is the word defenestration, which means for things to go out through a window. Okay. And I became most familiar with it because there is a study that was done a while back, maybe 7 or 8 years ago now, on the defenestration of cats in New York City. So, cats have a habit of saying, hey, open window, let's see where it goes. And they jump out the window. In New York City, this is a problem because sometimes that open window is pretty far up in the sky. And they actually did a study looking at the outcomes of defenestrated cats. And these are cats choosing to leave on their own, not their owners throwing one out the window or something like that. And they looked at data from veterinarians at cats that went to the vet after jumping out the window. And they found something kind of interesting about cats. This has nothing to do with anatomy and physiology. It's just fenestration. That cats that jumped out of windows from the ground floor up to, I think it was like the 7th floor, tended to survive. And cats that jumped out of windows from, I think it was the 15th floor up to a certain height, tended to survive. And it was that range in between of, and again, I think these are the right numbers, 7th to 15th floor, that there was a higher incidence of feline mortality from defenestration. And the explanation had to do a little bit with the sort of old wives' tale or whatever, that cats always land on their feet. They in fact do that. They can rotate their bodies sort of piecemeal to get their feet on the bottom so they can land easier. And up to 7 floors, they can do that successfully enough to survive. And if they don't do it, they still survive because it's not a very high fall for them. And from 15 floors up, they can do it because there's enough time for them to right themselves. Apparently, from that height, they hit terminal velocity, which means that they stop speeding up. They don't fall faster and faster because air resistance is pushing up against them. They're slowed down enough that they can orient themselves to land on their feet. And it's between 7 and 15 floors that they're falling too quickly to reliably have time to get their feet underneath them, and so they can have problems. So, again, has nothing to do with anatomy and physiology, just fenestrations are holes in the capillary wall. The word means window, and that's the only sort of connection I have to that word, other than actually, I think it's a German word for window is Fenster or something like that. And if I remember correctly, it's been a long time, the Spanish word is like ventana for window. Yeah, which is weird because fenestration is Latin, and you would expect the Latin-based language, Spanish, to have the same word and not the Germanic language, but actually it is. And I think I was saying this in one class one time, and somebody with far more intimate knowledge of Spanish did actually say that there's a word related to fenestration that isn't the common word for window, but it does still exist in the Spanish language to some degree. Where do we find continuous capillaries?
In the brain.
In the brain, and where else did I mention?
Testes.
Testes, right? Okay, so yes, it's coming back to me now. I remember ending on that thing, but yes. Where there's a privileged blood supply. So the two privileged blood supplies that come up in this course are the blood-brain barrier and the blood-testicle or testes barrier. For the brain, it's to keep infectious material from getting into the, I don't know if fragile is the right word, but we'll call it fragile tissue of the central nervous system. And in the blood-testes barrier, it's to keep potential mutagens out so that during sperm production, the DNA isn't mutated and passed on to the subsequent generations. So, since we're talking about capillaries, let me go to this picture. I would actually tend to skip over this picture and then talk about veins and come back to this in a little bit. But since we had the nice split between our last class and today here, it's fine to pick up this just to continue talking about capillaries. So capillaries are very small vessels that form a network or bed within tissues. This depiction is probably a little bit modest in how many capillaries you'd find in one particular area, but still there's a good bit of branching going on. Capillaries branch off of a vessel called the metarteriole. It's a branch off of the arterial side of circulation. So it's sort of like an arteriole, but I don't quite know what the prefix met here or meta is getting at, but it's a little bit different in that it doesn't have the smooth muscle layer of the tunica media around it. There are a few smooth muscle cells wrapped around here and there. And then where there are branches off of the metarteriole at the capillaries, there's a sphincter of smooth muscle called the precapillary sphincter. In this picture, all of those sphincters are depicted as closed and the blood is not flowing into the capillaries there. If you don't need blood to go into the capillary bed, if that tissue doesn't have a high demand for oxygen or nutrients at that time, there's no point in sending the blood through the capillaries because that oxygen might be needed somewhere else. There can be some exchange for the very basic needs for the tissue across the wall of the metarteriole, but all of these capillaries are closed off because this tissue might not need that much of the oxygen or nutrient supply from the blood. The metarteriole is depicted here colored in red, representing the oxygenated blood. And then it switches to blue as the blood becomes deoxygenated passing through this area. And the whole connection from the arterial side over there to the venous side here is called the thoroughfare channel. With the precapillary sphincters constricted, the thoroughfare channel basically shunts the blood directly over to the venous side, and the blood doesn't go through the capillary bed. It's also possible to completely bypass everything. And down at the bottom, we have what's called an arteriovenous anastomosis. An anastomosis is a blood vessel that bypasses other parts of circulation. And so this anastomosis bypasses a capillary bed by going directly from the arteriole to the vein. For the sake of this depiction, it's right next to the capillary bed, but more likely this type of anastomosis would be removed a bit from that. If you're trying to limit the amount of blood going to your extremities because you're in very cold conditions, then AV anastomoses, AV for arteriovenous anastomoses, are probably going to be found deeper. So if you don't want blood going out to your hand or your digits, because then you'll lose a lot of body heat, then anastomoses maybe in the wrist area would just bypass the hand altogether. You probably wouldn't 100% cut off blood to the hand because that tissue does need some blood, but the more that can be shunted away from the extremities, the better, because then you maintain some of your body. There's another type of anastomosis besides the atriovenous or AV anastomosis, and that's called an arterial anastomosis. Let me just write some of this down. Okay. So this bypasses and then the other type is called an arterial anastomosis. And this bypasses, I'll put clogged arteries. You've probably heard of bypass surgery when somebody has a risk of a heart attack. Bypass surgery can be a way to fix that. And what that means is somebody's at risk for a heart attack because one of their coronary arteries is clogged or occluded. And so the surgeon goes in and takes a little bit of blood vessel from the periphery somewhere, usually a vein out of the leg, and stitches it in on one side of the occluded coronary artery, and then goes around the occlusion and stitches it in on the other side so that it bypasses that part of the artery. That's a surgical intervention, but actually the heart can grow its own anastomoses to do that naturally. It tends to happen more in older people. Somebody who's 60 years old is more likely to grow arterial anastomoses than somebody who's 40. My father-in-law, I can't remember now, say 8 years ago, went in for bypass surgery, and he had triple bypass. He'd never had a heart attack. He just complained about some tightnesses in his chest, which was an indication that he was at risk for it. When they got in there, one of the arteries that they bypassed was 100% occluded. There was something grown up. I actually don't know if it's cholesterol or something else, but something had grown from the side of the blood vessel so much that it was completely blocked off. There might have been an arterial anastomosis in there that he'd grown naturally to circumvent that, which would suggest why having a completely blocked coronary artery didn't actually result in him having a heart attack. But they went in and surgically put in a new bypass around that area. So it's possible for that to happen. Somebody who's in their 60s is more likely to have them than somebody in their 40s, which is why you tend to hear that people in their 40s having heart attacks have more severe heart attacks because their body just doesn't have the means to kind of avoid the complications that might come from it. It would seem that the ability to grow these arterial anastomoses is advantageous as it's the kind of just wear and tear on the cardiovascular system that would happen over the course of several decades. And it's just in modern times that our diet and other stressors in our environment have made it so that younger people are having heart attacks. And our physiology just can't adapt quickly to those kinds of changes in our environment or in our lifestyles. So we see it in older people just because that's when it was needed over the hundreds of thousands of years that kind of internal, I guess is the word I'm looking for, recovery was possible. So those are arterial anastomoses, which actually gets us a little bit away from capillary beds. But since this picture introduces the AV anastomosis, I wanted to define the other type also. Now, the precapillary sphincters in this picture are only shown in certain locations. They're not around every single junction with the capillary and the thoroughfare channel. And that's simply because of the direction of blood flow. As blood flows from the meta-arterial into the capillary bed, it's going to flow into the capillaries that have the sphincters on it. It's not going to flow back into the other end of those capillaries and backfill the capillary bed. It's just not the way that blood flow is going to work. And also, if this side of the capillary is pinched off with the sphincter, this side of the capillary can't take in blood because what's in the capillary has nowhere to go. Sort of like when we had the did the hematocrit in lab, you collected the sample in the capillary tube because both ends were open, and then once you capped it off on one end with wax, the sample stayed in the tube. So same thing here. You can't fill the capillaries if one end's closed off by a sphincter, but you don't have to close off both ends of the capillaries to do that. Okay. Then the book goes on to talk about veins. Actually, let me just pull this picture up again real quick. Earlier we were talking about the different types of arteries. There are 3 types of arteries, and these are different types of arteries. This picture here suggests that there are 3 types of veins, but that's actually not true. There's only 2 types of vessels represented here. Venules are microscopic veins, and those are the vessels that capillary beds feed into. And then venules feed into veins. Here they have 2 different depictions, one called medium-sized vein, and one called large vein. Those are not different vessels. Those are both just plain old veins. And they just have different sizes. We're talking about the structure of arteries and veins at the beginning of all this, and here you can still see that the veins have the 3 layers, tunica media, tunica externa, tunica intima, and the structures are basically the same. The difference here is just the diameter of the vein. As veins get larger and larger, they look a little bit different. The book also depicts something which I'm not entirely sure is correct. In the medium-sized vein, they show filling kind of the lumen area of that vein a valve. Now, that is true. Veins do have valves. The pressure in the pressure of blood in valves is so low because we're so far away from the heart at that point that valves make sure that between systolic and diastolic pressure that the blood doesn't suddenly run backwards in the veins, especially for those in the lower extremities. And so blood will, with each heartbeat, be pumped back towards the heart. And so once it gets past one of these valves, it's not going to be able to go back and sort of pool up in the feet, as it were. And so the valves are there. What I don't think is exactly true as the book is kind of depicting it, is that the book suggests that large veins don't have valves. I don't think that's true. I think that large veins do have valves. I'm not an expert, so I can't say it for certain, but I don't think there's a size difference about whether they have veins or valves or not. I would say that the femoral vein, which is probably a large vein going through the thigh region, I would expect that that has valves as well as the smaller veins in the leg. Because you still have to get blood to move up against the force of gravity. You want those valves there to keep it down. I have no idea, although I've always kind of imagined that was true, if the inferior vena cava, which is the largest vein there is, if it has valves or not. It seems like it should. It has quite a ways to go, and the pressure is at its lowest possible level in the inferior vena cava. So there's got to be valves to make sure that the blood goes up. So, but they do sort of suggest there's two types of veins here, and it looks like it mirrors the three types of arteries, but in fact, there's only two types of veins, venules and veins. So, looking at the blood vessels overall, and especially considering the veins, this table sort of lays out how much of the blood in your body is distributed through the different parts of the cardiovascular system. So we have the heart, pulmonary circulation, and systemic circulation. About 85% of the blood in your body is in your systemic circulation, and then small bits are in pulmonary circulation, heart. And even within the systemic circulation, a large amount is found in the systemic veins. So about 2/3 of the blood in your body is in your veins. You have these large venous networks. Now, that's not saying that it's necessarily large veins. It's just extensive networks of veins through certain organs like the liver and bones, where blood kind of pools up. They say in integument, the skin, you sort of keep blood in your skin to help radiate off body heat when you're hot. When you don't want to lose body heat, then the blood leaves that particular venous network. You keep a lot of blood in your liver. If you look at the liver, it's a very dark red to purple color because of all the blood that's present in it. And bone marrow, red bone marrow especially, has a good bit of blood in it. So we store blood, so to speak, in the veins. Think back to the heart with cardiac output. One way to increase cardiac output is to increase the amount of blood going back to the heart, causing the heart ventricle walls to stretch out, increasing preload, and increasing stroke volume. When you need more blood to go back to the heart all of a sudden, you can take it out of the systemic veins, out of those networks especially. But there's a good bit stored in the veins in the other veins in your body. So there's a reservoir of blood in the veins, which that's the title of this section here. Yeah, that's the end of that section.
Was that?
Sorry?
What figure was that?
That was the end of section 20.1. Oh, actually. I don't know. That 2142, I don't know how that translates the actual figure caption number. Great. Okay. So it's the end of that section. Now, the next section, which we'll get to in a bit, is about describing blood flow and how it's regulated. Before I get into that, I want to just jump down. Whoops, actually, yeah. Oh, I thought I had to go a little bit further down. This is actually the first figure in here. And we'll talk about what this figure means in a second, but just to connect it back to what I was talking about earlier, let me show you down here. Along the x-axis, they're just laying out the systemic circulation. So from the heart, we go through the aorta, and then they have elastic arteries, muscular arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, medium and large veins together, and the vena cava. Now, it bothers me a little bit that they have the aorta and the vena cava separate off in this, but that's the way they have it out. The aorta is an elastic artery. The vena cava is a large vein. But what I want to point out is they do make a point that as we're moving from the heart through, we go through elastic arteries, and then we go through muscular arteries, and then we go through arterioles, and then capillaries, and veins. So even though the picture that I was showing you a little bit ago of the veins suggests that there's 3 types of vessels here, the book itself lays it out as medium and large veins are one group together. Okay, so the size is just talking about their diameter, but they're all veins. They're all one type of vessel. But where they have 3 types of arteries laid out, the book maintains that those are separate types of vessels. So keep that in mind. Okay, so this section of the book is dealing with blood flow and what regulates it. I've already mentioned that pressure is the main thing that drives blood flow. We'll get into some finer points of what's going on there, but we're trying to get from the heart, it's pumping the blood, through systemic circulation back to the heart, receiving the blood after it's passed through all the body. And pressure drops off. Okay? The only source of making the pressure is the pumping of the heart. And as blood's pumped out through the systemic circulation, pressure drops off until we get back to the heart. And it's a fairly efficient system. The pressure gets down almost to 0 here coming back. The heart doesn't have to work overly hard. We don't need excess pressure at the end because it doesn't help at all. It's okay that the pressure is practically down to 0. As long as the heart's beating enough to push the blood through the system, it's doing its job. If you ask the heart to pump more, then you're asking the heart to waste energy and possibly result in problems. But you don't want the heart to conserve energy too much, because if the heart doesn't pump enough to get the blood all the way through, if pressure drops off at this point, then the blood will never get back to the heart. So the pumping of the heart is sort of optimal for getting the blood around your body. The line that we have here kind of represents the pressure. The red line represents the pressure in the blood, as it's going through the arteries where it's oxygenated. And then the color switches to purple and blue as it goes into the capillaries and venules and veins as the blood becomes deoxygenated. The red line here going through most of the arteries is actually varying quite a bit, between about 80 and 120 millimeters of mercury. That variation, the difference between systolic and diastolic pressure, is what we call pulse pressure. If you're feeling for somebody's pulse, what you're feeling is that change in pressure. Okay? And you can feel that in the arteries. As we get further and further away, get down into the arterioles, that pressure change levels off, and so we have a constant pressure feeding into the capillaries. You don't want a variation in pressure going into the capillaries, because the capillaries have very thin walls, and if you are continually pushing against those walls with every heartbeat, like we see on the walls of the arteries, then you run the risk of damaging the tissue there. So you want the pressure to come together into a single constant pressure once we get into the capillaries. And then it's going to stay a single constant pressure the rest of the way through, because there's nothing that's going to certainly get it to go back to the pulse pressure difference that's driven by the heart doing its job. However, sometimes we want to consider the blood pressure in the arteries as a constant number. And so the gray line going through the middle here is basically the average. It's what we call mean arterial pressure, which essentially means, no pun intended, average. Nobody got that joke? Mean arterial pressure, basically, yeah, okay. Okay, maybe I did intend to have a pun there. Sorry, I'm struggling a little bit looking for the only marker that's, oh, duh, I don't need a marker, I'm gonna do another word. The only marker up here is yellow, which nobody would be able to read, but I gotta keep in mind, one, that I'm recording this, so I want people viewing this to be able to read it. And two, I can do it right here. Okay, so. Average blood pressure in arteries. Because the pressure actually varies, this is a calculation. So based on 120/80, the straight average would be what? It's the average of 120/80.
90?
Average 120 and 80.
100?
Right. So that's 120 plus 80, that quantity divided by 2, straight average, which equals 100. Now, I want to introduce another way to get to the same value, 100, which is to take the diastolic pressure. This is going to be really hard to type on the board. Diastolic pressure plus the pulse pressure divided by 2. Okay. That'll equal the average. So that would be 80 plus, what's the pulse pressure? What's pulse pressure?
Diastolic, systolic.
It's the difference between diastolic and systolic. So what is that number for 120/80?
40.
40, right. So that would be 40, and then we divide that by 2, which would be 80 plus 20, which is 40 divided by 2, which would equal 100. Okay. It's an odd way to get an average, but it's essentially the same thing mathematically. Okay. However, for mean arterial pressure, we take that same approach, but instead of getting to the basic average, we divide the pulse pressure by 3. Okay. So again, based on 120/80, that would be 80, which is the diastolic pressure, plus 40, which is still the pulse pressure, divided by 3. Okay. If you do that math, okay, so divide 40 by 3 and then add that to 80, the number you get is 93.3333. Okay. That's what mean arterial pressure is for 120/80. Okay. That 3 instead of a 2 that we divide the pulse pressure by makes the number come out a little lower. And that helps to recognize that the heart is resting more than it's beating. In fact, we're really only concerned with the ventricles. Okay? What the contraction of the atria isn't crucial here, because we're just talking about what's generating the pressure, pushing the blood through the system. The ventricles contract for 250 to 300 milliseconds, about 270 milliseconds is how long your average contraction of ventricular muscles is. And within, at resting heart rate, that's within 800 milliseconds. So 270 out of 800 is roughly a third of the time. Okay. I'm not going to bother to do the math right off the top of my head, but that should be the way it works out. So that dividing the pulse pressure by 3 gives us a way to adjust the average, considering that the heart is actually relaxed a little bit more than it's contracted. And so the pulse pressure for 120/80 would be 93.3333. And that's essentially where this gray line is. Okay, it's a little bit below 100. And that's what mean arterial pressure is. So the gray line that we see here, as it sort of feeds into the collapsed red line of the actual arterial pressure, going into arterioles and capillaries and continues on here. That shows us sort of a smooth curve for the whole thing. In the arteries, actually, because the beating of the heart has an effect, at any instant time along instant point along the timeline here of blood moving through the systemic circulation, we could find the pressure could be anywhere in between there. The mean arterial pressure is just a calculated sort of collapsed number there, roughly the average, but it's the average taking into account that the heart is in, or the ventricles are in diastole a little bit longer than they're in systole. So here's the definition of mean arterial pressure. What I typed on the screen a little bit ago, dia plus pulse divided by 3, diastolic blood pressure, which would be 80, plus systolic minus diastolic blood pressure, which is the pulse pressure, divided by 3, gives us mean arterial pressure. Okay. And here they show that written out in the text, okay, which gives us 93.33 for that mean arterial pressure. And they define pulse, and they point out places where you can feel pulse. You might tend to think normally right there at the wrist is a common place to feel it, or where the carotid artery is going through the neck, but there are a few other places that you can feel it. Did I talk? I must have in lab talked about measuring, blood pressure. So I won't revisit this figure here, just showing how blood pressure is measured, and I described that in lab. So now we want to consider the things that affect blood flow. Here they define some concepts that lead into it, but actually I want to concentrate on what this part says here. So I don't want to scare you so much with this rather complicated looking formula here, but I do want you to understand what this is talking about. So down below this, it defines what all these things are. Pi, you're probably familiar with. It's a constant, 3.1415, yada, yada, yada. It's a constant that we use when we're doing geometry involving circles, and we're assuming the cross-section of a blood vessel is a circle. Okay. And then delta P, delta is a Greek letter that's used to denote change or difference. So delta P is the change or difference in pressure where we're looking at blood flow. If we're looking at all of systemic circulation, then delta P would be essentially the blood pressure. The blood pressure at the end of systemic circulation is essentially 0, so the difference between the pressure generated by the heart pumping, and what it is at the end of circulation is just that blood pressure number. Okay. R is the radius, and then the exponent there, 4, works out for the math. And I don't think actually I'll get around to explaining why it's 4, not squared, but it plays a role there. And then underneath, in the denominator of this ratio, 8 is a constant that works out mathematically here. The thing that looks like an N with a little longer tail is Greek letter eta, which represents the viscosity of blood, how thick it is versus how watery it is. That's important because as blood gets thicker, if the water component of the plasma decreases, then blood flow will be harder, just like trying to push maple syrup out of, okay, this is going to sound really strange. Trying to suck maple syrup through a straw is much harder than trying to suck water through a straw. That's all about viscosity. Kind of off the cuff explanation, but that's exactly what it is. The thicker the blood is, the harder it is for it to move through circulation. And then this symbol, which looks like an upside down lowercase y, is the Greek letter lambda, which starts with an L and basically means length. So that's how long the blood vessels are. That's a component that influences circulation also. The farther that things have to circulate, the harder it is to push it along. We want the blood pressure to be just the right amount to push blood from the heart all the way through systemic circulation back to the heart. And if the blood vessels going from the heart back to the heart are longer, then you need more pressure to push the blood along. And that's why obesity is a heart risk factor, because the more tissue you have, the more blood vessels you have, the more distance blood has to actually travel through things. Now, other than defining those things here, we're not going to deal with them so much individually, except for a couple of things. We can boil down what's important to simply this ratio, that blood flow is the relationship of delta P over resistance. And I defined resistance in lag, but here we can see it sort of mathematically worked in. If we just break this down to the relationship of blood flow to each of these two things, we can say that blood flow is proportional to pressure, which I've been saying all along. Pressure is what causes blood to flow. Greater the pressure, the more blood will flow. And then blood flow is inversely proportional to resistance, which is to say more resistance means less blood flow. As we were looking at considering the diameter of arteries versus veins, based on the micrograph we looked at, maybe in lab, maybe last time, the more narrow lumen of an artery means that there's more resistance. There's more friction between the blood and the walls of the vessel. And the wider lumen of a vein means that there's less resistance. There's less friction between the blood and the walls of the vessel. The book then goes on to modify this a little bit. We want to kind of really stick with the idea of blood flow is proportional to pressure and inversely proportional to resistance. And as we affect those two things, we basically can regulate blood flow. The book goes on to define resistance a little bit by just swapping the terms here a little bit, so that resistance is related to pressure and blood flow as a ratio. And then they go on to, I guess because delta pressure and blood flow, since they're proportional, they kind of cancel each other out. And so resistance is all of the other things that were left over. Now, it's not on the board anymore, but pi and radius to the fourth power were on the top of that original ratio at the beginning. Now they're on the bottom, and it's just pi r to the fourth. Pi r squared is the area of a circle, right? Yeah. Pi r to the fourth is the same sort of thing, but since it's a higher power, 4 instead of 2, it's a larger number. The amount of resistance that is inversely proportional to blood flow is actually based on that fourth power. So these numbers are going to be very rough, but the difference between blood flow through a 1 centimeter segment of vessel versus 2 centimeters, nope, I said that wrong. The difference between blood flow through a 2 centimeter diameter blood vessel versus a 1 centimeter diameter blood vessel is actually like 16 units of blood flow less. There's a pretty significant change in blood flow because the math involving the radius, which is just half the diameter of the circle, is to the power of 4. So a small change in diameter of a blood vessel will make for a significant change in pressure. Going from 2 centimeters to 1 centimeter is going to make blood flow go down by a factor of 16. That's how it works out. When we're actually affecting blood flow, when we're seeing blood vessels constrict or dilate, we're actually only seeing slight changes. We're never going to be measuring the diameter of blood vessels to get a sense of it, but really what's happening are just very minor changes in the diameter of blood vessels that will result in pretty significant changes in blood flow. That's what we need to get out of this. Don't get bogged down with 8 and eta and lambda and pi and r to the fourth power. Just the take-home message there is resistance is very sensitive to diameter changes in the blood vessels. So a little bit of constriction, a little bit of dilation will make a lot of difference in blood flow in the end. All right, let's get back down here. So after all of the mathematical formula talking about this, it defines a number of these things. Blood volume, I think, just went off the screen. Blood viscosity, length and diameter of blood vessels. And then this sort of leads into a figure that ties a lot of these ideas together. And I hope this illustrates a lot of the concepts that I want you to get out of this. Again, before I go into talking about these individual curves, they have elastic arteries, muscular arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and then for whatever reason, the vena cava, which is a vein unto itself there at the end. So systemic circulation is really going through 1, 2, 3 types of arteries, capillaries, 2 types of veins before it gets back to normal, because the vena cava is a vein. Now, the first curve that we see here is just the vessel diameter in terms of where it is in the path of circulation. So elastic arteries, which include the aorta, starts at about 2.5 centimeters in diameter. And then diameter goes down as we see the arteries branch into smaller and smaller vessels, until we get to capillaries, which have an average diameter of about 8 micrometers, which is it has to be big enough for red blood vessels to go, red blood cells to go through. Some of them are a little bit smaller, but small capillaries don't do a whole lot. So most of them are going to be about 8 to 10 micrometers in diameter, which is essentially 0 on this scale because the scale is in centimeters. But then as we go from capillaries into venules and into veins, all the way back to the heart where the vena cava comes in, the diameters go back up. And actually notice that the diameter that they have for the vena cava is higher than the diameter at the start, which would be the aorta. Remember, veins are usually bigger than arteries. So if the aorta is 2.5 centimeters, then the vena cava, which is its complementary vein, has to have a greater diameter. So it's more up around 3 centimeters or so there. This is talking about the diameter of an individual vessel in any of these groups. Okay, so individual vessel diameters go way down, bottom out when we get to capillaries, and then come back up on the other end. Next curve here is looking at the cross-sectional area of these vessels. So again, starting with the aorta coming off the heart and going all the way through and back to the vena cava, which is the last of the veins. Cross-sectional area is pi r squared based on the radius of a particular vessel. Since I don't have a good marker in here, I'm not going to draw this up on the board. I can't really do anything on the screen easily to depict this. I believe I have a picture in the online content that lays this idea out, but I'll try to talk you through what I'm talking about. The cross-sectional area of the aorta, because the aorta is 2.5 centimeters. So let's say my hand's here in a circular fashion. This is the circumference of the aorta, 2.5 centimeters across. And so the cross-sectional area is how much area that one circle describes. As we get away from the aorta, the vessels get thinner and thinner, so their individual cross-sections get smaller and smaller. But as we're branching, we get more and more of them. And so as we go into the muscular arteries here, going through the elastic arteries and starting to the muscular arteries, the number doesn't seem to change, even though the diameter is getting lower and lower. But the cross-sectional area of one vessel with a 2.5 centimeter diameter and the cross-sectional area of 100 vessels with diameter of 1/4 centimeter, and I'm not doing the math in my head, I'm just making this up, is going to be about equivalent. I don't know if it actually is 100 1/4 centimeter versus 2.5 centimeters, but the idea is the more vessels you have, lots of little circles, all of the areas of all those circles will add up to the area of the single circle. And we start to see that cross-sectional area increase as we go into increasingly smaller and smaller diameter vessels. And that's because the number of vessels available is huge. So the greatest cross-sectional area in this curve lines up with capillaries because there's so many capillaries, even though they have maybe a 10 micrometer diameter, which is very little cross-sectional area for an individual capillary. There's so many capillaries in the body that overall the cross-sectional area goes way up. And then as we come back the other side, as the capillaries feed into venules, which feed into veins, which eventually feed into the single vein that connects back to the heart, the cross-sectional area goes down because the number of vessels goes down, even though the diameter increases. It never stays up. So if you sort of look at these two curves, one on top of the other, individual diameter goes way down as we go through circulation, but cross-sectional area of all the vessels in that region goes way up. So that sort of offsets the drop in diameter, which helps to maintain resistance at helps to maintain blood flow at kind of normal levels. As resistance in individual vessels drops off because diameter is going way down, the resistance across all of circulation goes way up because there's so many vessels that everything can go through. The blood has to go somewhere. To say that the resistance is really low on the capillaries doesn't mean that blood flow is going to stop. Blood flow can't stop, it has to keep going. So there are so many individual capillaries that all of the blood will just split up through all of that and make its way. So the resistance is kind of offset there. Then the curve C here is essentially the pressure one that we looked at before. Instead of seeing the pulse pressure represented on the arteries, it just has a flat line suggesting mean arterial pressure, except that they started at 100 instead of 93. But that line there is essentially the one that we looked at the beginning of this section. And so if you put blood pressure and resistance together, you get blood flow. So blood flows out of the heart pretty quickly, and it actually drops down quite a bit as you get to capillaries. Blood flow through capillaries is pretty slow, which provides time to allow for exchange of materials from the blood to the tissues, and from the tissue back into the blood. But then blood flow picks up as we move through the veins and get back to the heart. So there's still blood flow moving the blood back to the heart, even though pressure's dropped off quite a bit. And resistance that we have coming through the venous side is lower than the resistance we have on the arterial side, which helps to pick the blood flow back up and gets it back where it's supposed to be. So these four curves kind of put all of the ideas of that relationship, here. Blood flow is the ratio of pressure and resistance. That's the main core of what I want you to get out of this. The other expressions here kind of define it a bit more, but the main idea is blood flow is proportional to the difference in pressure and inversely proportional to resistance. And those two concepts applied based on the data in these four curves basically explains how blood flow is maintained through the system and gets blood back to the heart. Okay. Now, in the venous system, there are a couple of things that help blood get back to the heart even more. All of the active pumping of blood comes from the contraction of the heart muscle. But there are a couple of passive properties of the circulatory system that help things get all the way back to the heart. And the first one is the skeletal muscle pump, which we have a nice picture of. In your legs, which is essentially where this is most important, to help blood move up against the force of gravity, skeletal muscles, as they go from relaxed to contracted when you're walking around, like I am here at the front of the room, as they contract, they'll squeeze the veins going through that region of the leg. As a vein is squeezed, it pushes the blood up, which will push it through a valve into a higher part of the vein above. The blood can't be pushed back down because there's a valve right there. And then when these vessels relax, it'd be nice if there were a third picture depicting this, but when it's relaxed, the pressure in this part of the vein is pretty low, and so blood will move up into that. So when muscles contract, it pushes blood on further along the veins, and when skeletal muscles relax, it allows blood to move into that part of the vein. And it works as a passive pump. Okay? This happens when you're walking. If you don't move your legs, then this pumping isn't available to the circulatory system. And this is why you don't want to sit for a very long time. Like if you go on a cross-country plane trip, you want to get up and walk around the cabin a little bit. That'll help move, pull the blood that might be pooling up in your legs back to the rest of your body. So this is a skeletal muscle pump, a passive co-opting of skeletal muscle activity. So the cardiovascular system isn't expending any energy, it's just using skeletal muscles doing their regular job to help move blood along too. The other thing, which there's not a picture for, is the respiratory pump. It's kind of the same idea. It's a passive co-opting of another process in your body to get blood to move up into the heart against the force of gravity. What the respiratory pump is getting at is when you breathe, the pressures in your thoracic and abdominal cavities change. When you take a deep breath, you fill up your lungs with air, and that makes that's because your thoracic cavity is expanding, which pushes on your abdominal cavity, and the pressure in your abdominal cavity goes up, which is going to squeeze the inferior vena cava there, helping to push blood up. And then when you exhale, so your blood, when you exhale, then the opposite happens. Your lungs recoil back or collapse back to their resting state. Thoracic volume decreases. It allows the abdominal cavity to expand and give off a little bit of the pressure that built up when you breathed in, and the blood will go up. You just push the blood up from the abdominal cavity when you breathe in. When you breathe out, then blood from the lower legs can move up into the abdominal cavity where the pressure is now lower again. So it's the same idea as the skeletal muscle pump, just passively using the squeezing of veins because of something else going in your body to push blood up and not come back down. And it's because of the respiratory pump that I'm pretty sure that there are valves in the vena cava. Because if you didn't have valves in the vena cava, with every breath, when the pressure in the abdominal cavity goes down, then blood would just go back down into the abdominal cavity. So there's got to be a valve that's keeping it in the thoracic cavity there. So, but again, I'm not positive about that. I've not done the research into it, but it would make sense. Which kind of wraps up the blood flow pressure stuff. Okay. In the capillary exchange section, there's just this one picture of any import that shows across the length of capillaries, the change in pressure that we see in capillaries actually drives moving things from the blood into the tissue and then allows for things from the tissue to move into the blood. Now, in this picture, they show a capillary that's roughly 4 cells long. Capillaries would be longer than that. To fit it in the picture here, it looks kind of short. The blood coming into the capillaries from the arterial side is going to be entering with a pressure of 35 millimeters of mercury. And then pressure at the end, as the blood moves into the venous side, is going to be leaving at 18 millimeters of mercury. The 35 millimeters of mercury number on the arterial side is fairly constant, kind of every source says that. The venous number can be different. Here it's 18. I've seen other places say 16. It doesn't really matter exactly what the number is. The idea that it drops off. Now, on the arterial side, you have a process that we call filtration happening, which means that things inside the blood are filtered out across the capillary wall into the interstitial fluid, which means that nutrient molecules, oxygen, all those things are going to come out during filtration. Filtration is not just a matter of that 35 millimeters of mercury pressure pushing things out of the blood, but rather the net filtration pressure, that's the difference between the blood pressure, which here is referred to as capillary hydrostatic pressure, and an opposing pressure here called the blood colloidal osmotic pressure, or osmotic pressure, that's pulling water back in. Now, the blood has in it things like blood cells and large plasma proteins that don't cross the capillary walls that make the blood hypertonic to some degree than the interstitial fluid. So as blood pressure is pushing things out for filtration, osmotic pressure is pulling water and other things back into the blood to try to dilute the blood so that it's equivalent in concentration to interstitial fluid. That's what the osmotic pressure is. The difference between those two, the osmotic pressure is 25 millimeters mercury. The difference between those two at the beginning of the capillary bed is 10 millimeters of mercury causing outward filtration. On the other side, the colloid pressure hasn't changed because the components of the blood haven't significantly changed, but pressure's dropped off as we've gotten across the capillary bed. So now the difference between these two is -7 millimeters of mercury, and the negative just means that there's more osmotic pressure than blood pressure, so things are going to move in from the tissue into the blood, which will carry water molecules back in, as well as waste products from the tissue will move into the blood. The nutrients that have come out of the blood are absorbed by the cells of the tissue, and those cells also have waste to give off, and those wastes come back in here. The thing is that the difference between these two, absolute difference between these two, means that it's not an even exchange. Okay? That's +10 over there at the arterial side and -7 over here. When I say in absolute terms, I mean the absolute value of that is 10 millimeters of mercury. The absolute value of this is 7 millimeters of mercury. They're not even. Okay? you would want to have an even exchange. All of the water that leaves during filtration needs to be reclaimed. The only way that's going to happen is if the net filtration pressure on the venous end is negative 10 milliliters of mercury, which it isn't. That means that not all of the water that comes out of the blood at filtration gets back into the blood with reabsorption. That water accumulates in the tissues. And so there's a little bit more to the circulatory system than just the blood vessels we've been talking about here. There's also what are called lymphatic capillaries. I'm going to jump ahead I'm going to jump ahead to the lymphatic system where we can see what's going on here. So here we have the arterial venule with a capillary bed in between them we looked at before, but now there are these green things in here which are called lymphatic capillaries. This is another type of vessel. It's not a cardiovascular vessel, it's not a blood vessel. It's part of the lymphatic system, which is the next chapter we'll be getting to. The water that comes out of the blood vessels because of that higher filtration pressure versus the reabsorption pressure, the water that comes out into the tissue will actually go back into the lymphatic vessels to be cleared out of the tissue, so that the tissue doesn't build up with excess water. So I'm talking about this now, since we're talking about capillaries and capillary exchange. We're going to come back to this idea in the next chapter, sort of tie in the lymphatic system with the circulatory system. So keep that in mind. In this section of the book on capillary exchange, chapter 20, section 3, the main thing to talk about is that the blood pressure across capillaries drops off, driving filtration on the arterial side and allowing for reabsorption on the venous side. Those two values are not identical, and so there's some water lost from the system. And so at the end of this section, there's a little blurb, paragraph, whatever, the role of lymphatic capillaries, explaining lymphatic capillaries reclaim that water. The next chapter we get to, we'll be looking at the lymphatic system, and we'll pick up the story there to see what happens to that water. So moving on with the cardiovascular system and blood vessel chapter, the next section is about the homeostatic regulation of blood pressure. This picture lays out, actually, let me make this picture a little bit bigger. Lays out the processes that play a role in regulating blood pressure. The top part of it is talking about autoregulation, how blood vessels kind of regulate themselves. If blood vessels stretch out too much because blood pressure is high, they'll respond with things to lower blood pressure themselves. Or I should say, if blood flow increases too much. I guess I don't know. All right, let me just start that whole idea over. Autoregulation, blood vessels help to regulate blood flow. So there are sensors for checking on blood flow, and if blood flow is too low, then blood vessels will dilate, decreasing resistance and allowing more blood flow. If blood flow is too high, then blood vessels will constrict, restricting blood flow through that blood vessel. And it's just mentioning a few different things that play a role there. For capillary beds, then that'll play into controlling the capillary sphincters, increasing or decreasing blood flow through particular tissues, and hopefully getting us back to homeostasis. The other side of this is more systemic things that control blood vessels. And let me do this. Okay. About as close as I can get to fitting the whole thing on the screen. But so the more systemic things are basically the nervous system and the endocrine system regulating blood pressure or blood flow. So the neural mechanism, basically meaning the autonomic system, can regulate blood pressure as well as the chemistry of blood, what's present in the blood and how that will affect it. In the medulla, we already met the cardiovascular centers, and there's specifically regions in the medulla that are called vasomotor centers, controlling the muscles of blood vessels, instead of the heart muscle that we met for cardiac output in last chapter. And so this lists a few different things that are done to control things. Have I talked about nitric oxide before?
Yes.
Was that in lab or in lecture? Okay, so everybody. So here's where it's mentioning some nitric oxide stuff. And then on the endocrine side of things, there are hormones from the kidneys, from the adrenal glands, from the brain, and from the heart directly that'll have a role to play in regulating blood vessels, blood pressure. This little flow chart kind of paints a picture of how this is regulated. When we get to the renal system, we're going to consider what's going on here in a bit more detail, because the renal hormones, especially renin that controls angiotensin and aldosterone, play a big part. Aldosterone actually is an adrenal hormone, adrenal corticoid, but its release is tied to this renal hormone called renin, and there's an intermediary. I don't know why they're referring to it as angiotensinogen there. It's angiotensin is the more common name. But we'll talk about that process in a lot more detail when we get to the renal system. Here, just be aware that it exists. We'll also, at that point, consider how the heart regulates things through what are called they have atrial natriuretic peptide here. Hormone here. It is a peptide hormone. Atrial is referring to the atrial wall of the heart. There's actually two hormones. Atrial natriuretic peptide or hormone is ANP or ANH. And then there's a BNP. So there's an A and a B. What the B stands for isn't important. But basically when the heart wall stretches out too much because blood pressure is high, the heart releases its own hormones that will decrease blood volume and therefore blood pressure and help to regulate things. And we'll actually be talking about all of those things again in the renal system as we talk about this part right here in the most detail, the renin-controlled series of hormones that help regulate things. And then what the brain and the heart do to modify that as well. Oh, that's right. Hold on a second. So this just sort of comes back to the cardiovascular centers of the brain and talks a little bit more about how they play a role in vasomotor control and blood pressure control besides just cardiac output. Yeah, so in the figure I was just pointing out, they use the word angiotensinogen. It's supposed to be angiotensin. It's a better way. So here in the book right there, they say it correctly. Here's a little bit more on that stuff. And what happens in blood loss and that kind of thing, just more details. The circulatory pathways, that's the lab material I talked about in lab, where the vessels themselves are. And then there's a section on development, which we won't deal with. We don't tend to touch development in this course at all. And then the next chapter on the what do we call this? Sorry? Lymphatic system, yes, thank you. Just playing for a second. Okay, so that actually wraps up the blood vessel stuff. I was kind of expecting that to go into next week, next lecture on Thursday. And then, of course, after Thursday, we have spring break. Now, nobody stopped by my office yesterday going, why aren't you in lab? So I assume everybody remembered yesterday that we didn't have lab. Let me remind the Wednesday people, tomorrow also we don't have lab. I'm actually going to be doing a makeup test in the lab during our lab period tomorrow. So don't bother coming by. I won't let you in the room. Also, since we have that wonderful sort of break in the middle of the semester here, taking on the next chapter going on in here, starting to talk about it on Thursday, and then taking a week off and then coming back after that, really kind of throws everybody's minds off, especially when you're all concentrating on the practical. So I'm going to cancel Thursday's lecture this week, okay? Because you're not going to retain anything this Thursday. Between about to have spring break and also worrying about the practical that you have the week after spring break. So there's not lab tomorrow, and we also will not have lecture this Thursday. So enjoy your spring break a little bit earlier, or use that extra time to prepare for the practical that you have coming up. And then, is it the 21st the day we get back from?
Yeah.
Okay, so the 21st, Monday morning, the Monday lab has their practical, and then we'll have class on the 22nd, and then Wednesday lab on the 23rd. You have your practical then. So anybody have any problems with this? No lab tomorrow, no lecture on Thursday. See everybody the week after break. All right, have a good one.